you've been called by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as Mr. Fiscal Responsibility, I guess.
Well, I know the first year I was in the Congress, the national
Hold it a moment, please. Mr. Congressman, you have been called by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as Mr. Fiscal Responsibility, pro-taxpayer, so to speak. First of all, how do you account for that particular title?
Well, I have had one of the most fiscally conservative voting records in the Congress since I've been here, and this is my 21st year. But I will tell you a little story. A couple of months ago at church in Knoxville, the minister said, I don't know how many of you are fans of Garrison Keillor, the famous radio man, but he said he grew up in this very silent Norwegian family in Minnesota where they hardly ever even spoke to each other. They sat down to the same boring fish and potatoes meal every night. And he said his fondest wish as a teenager, he wished his dad would come in and announce, we're not really Norwegian, we're Italian, bring out the wine and spaghetti and let's party. And my wife turned to me at that point and said, well, my fondest wish is you would tell us your heritage is not really Scottish, let's go spend money. And so I guess that I've always been personally very conservative with my money, and I just think that a lot of the problems that we have today, in fact most of the problems we have today, are because we've lived way beyond our means as a government, and it just astounds me when we're talking about trillions of dollars in debt, and I think it puts our future and our very near future in great jeopardy.
Well, how would you have handled this crisis differently from what is being done now?
Well, I think the big problem with it all is we're spending money that we do not have, and you know, we've raised our national debt limit to over $13 trillion, and of course that's an incomprehensible figure. But what I've said, you know, I was one of 6 Republicans who voted against the war in Iraq because I thought that you know, that we couldn't afford it, and I thought there were much better ways to go about that. And in the same way, I think there were much better, cheaper alternatives that we could have done to help our economy in this country. For instance, I think we should have given a tax credit to anyone who would buy a new or used car or truck, and I think we should have given a very significant tax credit to anyone who would buy or build a new house. Much more so than we did. We did that to a limited extent by giving an $8,000 credit to first-time home buyers, but I think we should have gone far beyond that, and I think those two things would have done much more, and there are other things we could have done too.
The Congress does not seem to have been responsive to the real situation that existed some years ago. This crisis obviously didn't occur overnight.
Well, that's true, and in fact, several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I voted to put some very strict limitations or restrictions on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But I think the highest number of votes that we got for the toughest amendment was like 92 votes in the House, and of course that was not nearly enough. But the root of the problem now, and the stimulus is going to work for a short time because it's pumping a massive amount of money into the economy. The problem is that I think it brings much closer our day of reckoning. That and I used to say that I thought it was terrible what we were doing to our children and grandchildren, but now I think it's terrible what we're doing to ourselves, because I don't think it's going to be many years at all, maybe 10 or 15 at the most, if that long, before we're not going to be able to pay all of our Social Security and Medicare and all the things we promised our own people. And so that's a concern to me. But the biggest problem that we have in this country today is the banking situation. And what we have the presidents, both President Bush and President Obama, and the secretaries of Treasury and the people at the top, telling the banks to go out and lend money, but then you have the examiners down on the ground level telling writing up the banks for every loan that they make almost, and they've got the banks gun shy about making almost any loan, even to people with very good credit.
Well, one of the things, obviously, that occurred is the fact that, as you say, we spent more than we were able to.
Right.
But how about holding accountable the directors of these banks who got us into the situation in the first place?
Well, that would be fine with me, and in fact, I voted to put some limitations on the executive compensation that could be paid to all these companies that were getting massive amounts of federal money. I wouldn't ordinarily I wouldn't be in favor of putting any kind of limitations on what a private company could pay with totally private money. But I thought if a bank or some other company is going to take the billions from the taxpayers, that it was reasonable to put some limitations on their salaries and bonuses.
Are we close to nationalization of banks today, do you think?
Well, I sure hope not. I think it would be a horrible mistake. I don't think we should nationalize any industry, and I think that that it would create worse problems than we have now if we go to that extent.
But isn't the basic problem, as you have said at the start here, the fact that we created almost a Ponzi scheme of borrowing without any responsibility behind it?
Well, I agree with that, but I think that we did too much to encourage or even insist that banks make loans to people who did not have good credit and who really could not afford those loans. And it amazes me that young people in this country just don't look at debt like I have, and like people who've come, generations who've come before me. I mean, me personally, I'd rather sleep on the floor or sleep on a bed that's not paid for. And I think the only things that anybody should ever borrow money for is a business that has a very good chance, or at least a reasonable chance of success, and a modest-sized home that they can afford. I can see borrowing some on that, but we've had young people who've gone out and bought $400,000 and $500,000 homes or even more that they couldn't even come close to affording.
Well, certainly you're following the tradition of your father who served here before.
Well, I was very proud of my father. My grandparents in Tennessee had 10 kids in an outhouse and not much more. And my father hitchhiked into Knoxville with $5 in his pocket and worked his way through the University of Tennessee, and then 20 years later was elected mayor, and 6 years after that was elected to Congress. And so I grew up in a political family, and I was 11 years old when my father first ran for mayor. And I will never forget the very first car that I went to ask the man, could I put a John Duncan bumper sticker on his car? He told me in a very hateful way, he said, I wouldn't vote for that man if he was running against a jackass. And I was so bashful that really shook me up, and I'm so slow that it wasn't until about 45 or 47 years later I thought I should have said, he is. He really wasn't, but that would have been a good comeback.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's a very busy season, and for you to take time out to speak to 160 different parliaments throughout the world. What would you say to them if you could?
Well, I've traveled extensively all over the world, and I think that's been the most educational thing I've ever done. And I've always found that the people in other countries sure did seem to appreciate me and other members of Congress coming there. And I love to have members of parliaments from other countries come to visit me here in my office in Washington. I would certainly welcome that. And before we end this, I do want to say that I've had the greatest respect and admiration for you, because you had a long and distinguished career in the Congress. And I was on another television show many years ago that you did, and so I appreciate you asking me to do this again today.
Well, thank you so much. And now we'll send you a message to the Congresses throughout the world.
Thank you.
Thank you again.